right, thank you everyone, and welcome back to the closing remarks of our conference, Religion and Democracy on the African Continent, Colonial Legacies and Post-Colonial Possibilities. I would like to begin by inviting Professor Jacob Olupona to deliver his reflections on the conference and the field. Professor Olupona is a kind of founding father of the study of religion and democracy, religion and governance, religion and society in Africa. As you know before, or many of you may know, Professor Olupona is Professor of African Religious Traditions, Harvard Divinity School, and Professor of African American Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. He studied at University of Nigeria in Nsukka and Boston University, where he received his PhD in comparative religion in 1983. He's currently working on groundbreaking studies on the growth of evangelicalism across all branches of Christianity, expanding the current discourse that's largely focused on Pentecostalism and looking at the larger context of Nigerian Christianity. He's authored numerous books, including Kingship, Religion and Rituals in the Nigerian Community, a phenomenological study of Ondo Yoruba festivals, and City of 201 Gods, Ile-Ife in Time, Space, and the Imagination. He's also published a recent edited volume, Ifa Divination, Knowledge, Power, and Performance, which analyzes the famous tradition of Ifa divination from numerous perspectives, such as theology, art, aesthetics, philosophy, and cultural studies. Professor Olupona has received prestigious grants from almost everybody who gives grants: the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, the Ford Foundation, Davis Humanities Institute, Rockefeller Foundation, the Renner Grant Foundation, and the Getty Foundation, to name just a few. He served on the editorial boards of many influential journals, was the president of the African Association for the Study of Religion. He received an honorary doctorate in divinity from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, honorary doctorate of letters from Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, and the University of Abuja in Nigeria. In 2008, he was awarded the highest distinction the Nigerian government bestows on civilians, the Nigerian National Order of Merit, and was inducted into the Nigerian Academy of Letters in 2015. That same year, he was honored with a Reimar Lust Award by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. So Professor Olupona, I would invite you to share with us some of your closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Let me say to all our mothers and wives who are here, Happy Mother's Day. We celebrate you. Let me just leave it like that. I want to thank Oludamini again and Robert Vincent for bringing me back to say a few words and to share my thoughts with you. He has specifically asked me to speak on my experiences in this field, in this enterprise, his development, his importance, and my general advice to those who are working on this topic or these broad issues. It doesn't have to be formal, as he said, just to share some reflections. So my duty is not to give you a summary of what we've been doing for the past 2 days. That is going to be impossible. I think I leave that to him. So I want to keep strictly to the assignment that he has given me. So in addition to really expressing my deep appreciation to him and his colleagues, and to all of us who have gathered here, I first of all want to say that going through these very massive papers of the conference papers, which the organizers have made available to us before, which we managed to read, I think some of us, before the conference, I found it to be pretty mind-boggling. A lot of preparation went into this project, and the choice of topics, the themes, the caliber of scholars assembled here attest to the hard work and the preparation that preceded this meeting. This is honestly the best that I have seen in at least in many years, particularly in the post-COVID era. And what I see here in the last 2 days is the fact that the value, the strength of interdisciplinary studies came out very clearly. We were engaged in theological, social scientific, and humanistic studies. And in doing this, we also take historical reconstruction very seriously. And the critical textual and literary studies that came out in the research of many of our colleagues was quite fascinating to me. These kinds of interdisciplinary studies sort of enable us to bring out a lot of findings and the discussions and the questions that came out of it. I want to say that while the subject matter, of course, is religion and democracy in Africa, the post-colonial legacy and post-colonial possibilities, the interdisciplinary approach that came out of this work really enables us to understand very clearly what the issues are. Some of the possibilities, the problems, and issues that are still ahead of us. I'm also thrilled to see the combination of both the critical theory and the substantive studies, history, ethnographic studies. There's no single paper that I had that was devoid of these two things, that all the papers, of course, presented both the theory part and also the analytic sections, and I want to congratulate the organizers for giving us sufficient instructions that kind of help us to produce this fascinating work. I was going to comment on the product, and I have now heard that there will be a publication after it. I think we deserve to have one, but I'm also going to mention that that in doing so, please make sure that you publish this with a press that will produce that will produce the African edition of it, so that this work will be made available to our colleagues in African universities who are often not privileged to be part of a conversation like this. So I hope you will take that seriously. I suspect that the reason why you have given me this assignment to do here is that for the past 15 years, we have been together when you were an undergraduate and then when you became a graduate student. And of course, I have to mention your brother, Divinity Ogunnaike. Both of you who have really done very well. And you know, I'm very proud of you and that you have become successful scholars and of course, up and coming intellectuals. I do see that too as part of my legacy, if you allow me to make claim to it. One lesson to take home for me, one of several lessons, came out of Professor Alidel's remark, and I want to sort of just mention it here. She pointed to the importance of building communities of the scholarship that will transcend ethnic, racial, and religious divides. I was very happy to see old friends here. I'm very glad to meet new ones and new friends. I'm going to follow up on some of these conversations and the names that I just came across. So together we can build communities via this type of conferences, and Oludamini and his colleagues have sort of shown us how best to do it. On another personal note, on scholarship, I recall how my former teacher, Peter Berger, used to talk about religion. And in those classes, and a particular one, when he reminded us that religion can be studied both in terms of its origin, its functions, and intrinsic essence and qualities. I recall, though, that he didn't like the fact that I used to talk positively about Nyerere. He said Nyerere was a bastard, a socialist, but he didn't ask me not to, of course, theorize religion, and I still recall that. The reason why I'm bringing this thing up is that as you look at all the lectures and all the things mentioned, you will find out that these three things are there. The questions of history, historical trajectory, and of the tradition we are studying. The questions of course, functions, which is the area political scientists, anthropologists, and the rest, and psychologists often talk about, and the phenomenological hermeneutics section that allows us to look at the essence. What in religion we often call religion, the religion in terms of its essence came out. The reason why I always insist that my students take this thing seriously, and I encourage them to also apply it to other work they do, even outside my class, is because these kinds of framework allows us to be very comprehensive, to be interdisciplinary, and to cover a lot of grants. And lastly, I want to say that we shouldn't limit our work to publications alone, or to publications in terms of journals and books, but we must begin, given the situation in Africa today, to make sure that our voices are heard without necessarily calling ourselves public intellectuals, but to see the importance of that we need to be able to make a scholarship available to the general public. So that means that we must use the kinds of a language that is accessible. There are going to be resistance. As I was listening to Professor Chono today in his very fascinating lecture where he cited Awolowo. I mean, we all know the problem there, that the resistance from the state, from the people, even the very people you are trying to help, is an indication how difficult our work is. But I believe that, in my own case, these kinds of interventions we have done in many ways. When they were talking about gender, I knew how it was difficult for me to even encourage young African women scholars from Nigeria to come here to do 3 months, 6 months to do their work. And who were the people opposed to it? They are chairs of department who, in fact, told me I was coming to disrupt their lives I was setting these women to rebel against the status quo. A woman who's working on women in the Old Testament, and the head of the department doesn't want to hear the word gender study and gender analysis. We have to take risk. We have to take risk, and it is very important to scholarship. And lastly, permit me to introduce to you a very important project that we are trying to do. The IFE Institute of Advanced Studies, the IFE Summer Institute, which we organize for postdoc and pre-doc, is an attempt to begin to encourage young scholars who are on the continent. It's not a Nigerian thing, it's an African thing, to begin to look at their fields, to look at sources for research. We've been doing this now for 2017, and I'm glad that we are making significant progress. I will encourage Professor Ogunnaike to share with you the announcement for the Summer Institute for this year. And hopefully, we would like to you to join us as professors would like you to recommend your students to be part of this initiative. Thank you again for inviting me. It's been a wonderful, wonderful conference for me. The last two days, I've been very faithful to coming in and seeing everything. I thank you very much. I'm proud of you, and I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Olupona, for those kind words and closing remarks. I'm reminded of the Yoruba proverb that says, if you see a child that's reached something high, then you know he stood on the shoulders of elders who are taller than him. And it's by standing on your shoulders and the shoulders of Professor Khan and my colleagues here at UVA, and actually really everyone who was a panelist here. If you were invited to speak at this conference, it's because I have read your work, we have read your work and been influenced by it. And so we've stood collectively on your shoulders. I also want to acknowledge today being Mother's Day, my own mother and my late father, who also contributed to. If this conference is good, it owes a lot to my mentors, my graduate mentors at Harvard, to all of you conference participants, both on the panels and in the audience, and to my family. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Robert Vinson, Director and Chair of the Carter G. Woodson Institute, for his support and the support of the Institute. The publication will be available as an ebook, and we'll make sure there's an African publication and printing of this. There will also be summary version of conference proceedings that will be put on the Africa as a Country website as well too, so be on the lookout for that. I'd also like to acknowledge the UVA Institute of Humanities and Global Cultures and the Page Barber Funds for their support. And finally, but perhaps most importantly, the UVA Democracy Initiative's Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, particularly Ms. Ashley Duffalo, who is really the one who has made this conference possible and run smoothly. Thank you so much, Ms. Duffalo, for making this happen. This would not have worked at all without you. Thank you so much. So now I'd like to turn to my own closing remarks on this, trying to synthesize much of what we've heard over 2 days. So it's going to be a bit of a difficult task. So in speaking of religion and democracy, one interesting thing which Professor Ochonu brought up in his presentation at the end was that the kind of religion of democracy, that is this kind of missionary zeal to spread the gospel of liberal democracy, and the promise that participation in these rituals of multi-party electoral politics were somehow supposed to miraculously resolve the continent's problems, or even problems in North America or other places, leading to the coming of the kingdom and glory down in Africa, even as it is in the West, are wearing thin, as the colonial chickens of scarcity, inequality, and violence are increasingly coming home to roost in the global North itself. So inspired by Elnathan John, it's a very funny Nigerian satirical writer, I would argue that this kind of liberal Lord's Prayer, our liberal democracy who art in the West, hallowed be thy name, thy empire come, thy will be done, in Africa, even as it is in the West. Give us this day our daily aid, forgive us our barbarity, as we forgive thy barbarities against us, and lead us not into corruption, but deliver us from violence. For thine is the good governance and the power and the money until the end of history. Amen. This kind of liberal Lord's Prayer, which was adopted as orthodox for a very long time in certain circles, has now grown fainter and fainter around the world. And returning to Amilcar Cabral, who I invoked in the introduction, we've heard before, he noted the colonialists usually say that they brought us into history. It's not so. They made us leave history, our history, to follow them right at the back, to follow the progress of their history. Professor Mamdani says this in a kind of other way in one of his writings. He says, all resistance movements are shaped by the powers against which they rebel, often imitating them unintentionally, that is, adopting their categories and institutions. And I want to follow these two quotes, the kind of thrust of them, across the fields of religion, race, and then democracy. So starting with religion, as I quoted earlier, David Chidester wrote in Savage Systems, when a frontier opens, the enemy has no religion, but when a frontier closes and hegemony has been established, a dominated, subjected people are discovered to have a religion that can be inventoried and analyzed. That is, this dynamic is very important because generally all of the so-called non-Western literary, aesthetic, political, social traditions eventually came to be categorized as religious. If you want to study Yoruba philosophy, political norms, you generally have to do that in a religious studies department. They were categorized as religious and typically as inferior to the newly formed secular, which was given universal reign. This legacy still haunts us, as I mentioned, the categorization of non-Western thinkers, intellectual, social, political traditions as religious or as pre-modern or even as pre-colonial, despite their continued existence and relevance, and their general treatment as mere historicized objects of particular data of marginal, if any, theoretical or political importance. Whereas modern, secular, Western, and almost invariably white counterparts are elevated to the level of universal models to be applied beyond their own historical context. So as Tomoko Masuzawa writes in her book, The Invention of World Religions, in contrast, every region of the non-modern non-West was presumed to be thoroughly in the grip of religion, as all aspects of life were supposedly determined and dictated by an archaic metaphysics of the magical and supernatural. And Theodore Weil begins his book, Race and Religion, by saying race and religion are conjoined twins. They are the offspring of the modern world. Because they share a mutual genealogy, the category of religion is always already a racialized category, even when race is not explicitly under discussion. Now, Vincent Lloyd helpfully combines these two insights for us. He writes, quote, "Put more starkly, whiteness is secular and the secular is white. The unmarked racial category and the unmarked religious category jointly mark their others. Or to put it another way, the desire to stand outside religion and the desire to stand outside race are complementary delusions, for the seemingly outside is in fact the hegemonic. But rather than mourn the extent of neoliberal hegemony or capitalist hegemony, as much contemporary critical scholarship has a habit of doing, remembering the religious or the theological, as the unmanaged religious is sometimes called, points to traditions of imagining otherwise." And this is what I think is really crucial and what so many of our papers have brought up over the past 2 days. That is the idea that our critical academic theories, methods, and secular liberal modes of governance, the ones that are hegemonic now anyway, somehow transcend religion and race in a way that their governed subjects do not, is a dangerous and colonial delusion, but one which, or neo-colonial delusion, but one which those approaches and traditions that have been classified as theological, non-Western, religious, etc., can help disabuse us of, as we saw in Professor Omesha's paper. For example, new works of political theology have pointed out the theological and religious dimensions inherent in supposedly secular discourse, revealed in phrases like democratic backsliding, and the kind of magical thinking that Professor Ochoni referred to, that the adoption of democracy of any kind will somehow solve all of Africa's problems. Political theologians have further argued that, taking up Weber's notion of disenchantment that we heard about earlier this morning, that disenchantment is not so much about the disappearance of magic and mystery from the world so much as their transformation. It's about the violent destruction of old social and metaphysical bonds which tied people to one another and to the world around them in order to bind them to new masters who were appropriating for themselves both legal and sovereign power, to nation states and imperial powers and ideals. That is, if we take Charles Long's formulation of religion as orientation, everybody worships. Everybody's got an orientation, and secularity doesn't abolish worship, but rather redirects its orientation and forms. So on the one hand, discussing race, Charles Mills explains to us it's imperative to appreciate the deep influence of race in modernity, not merely on everyday cognition, but on supposedly rigorous theorization in the academy. Race shapes the development of such modern academic disciplines such as sociology, political science, anthropology, criminology, international relations theory, and many others, that include religious studies there, as well as older disciplines from the pre-modern period like philosophy and history. The casual and near ubiquitous assumption of white racial superiority, biological and cultural, distorts all of them. Right. While on the other hand, taking up religion, the works of Talal Asad, Hussein Agrama, Saba Mahmoud, Catherine Adcock, and many, many others, including Rabiata Kande, have demonstrated the particular, number one, the particular theological and historical roots of the mutually constituting secular religious dichotomy, which is often ahistorically presented as a universal, and the ways in which, contrary to its often invoked neutrality or non-interference in matters of religion, the implementation of secularism and religious freedom even requires a nation state to define, constitute, and even regulate religion. And these works also, number three, prove the ways in which, in the name of reason or public order or social harmony, secular states tend to elevate majoritarian or hegemonic values and visions of reality to transcendent norms of supposed neutrality that are enforced by usually the violent power of the state. Okay, so that we have race on the one hand, religion on the other hand. Now, coming back to Cabral's talk about the colonialists having us follow them right at the back of their history. Frederick Lugard, the founder of the colony of Nigeria, wrote in his dual mandate in British tropical Africa, he says, if there's unrest and a desire for independence as in India and Egypt, it is because we have taught them the value of liberty and freedom, which for centuries these people had not known. Their very discontent is the measure of their progress. So this speaks to the chauvinism, the idea that there's only one form of democracy, one form of good governance, and that's located in the particular history of the West that Professor Ochonu spoke about. In a kind of more popular and funny mode, Fela Kuti in his Teacher Don't Teach Me Nonsense song kind of poked fun at this idea of colonial masters as teachers, particularly teachers of democracy. So Fela said, when speaking about how he composed this song, he said, I realized when a Western educated person says democracy, they say democracy, but in Nigerian, quote unquote, broken English, it sounds more like this, democracy. He said, and I realized democracy, them all crazy. So the African democracy is really a crazy demonstration of craze. And he put that in his song to say, okay, if you are teachers really, then you have taught us this democracy. And so if our democracies are not working right, then it's because you've taught us improperly. Now, Mamdani kind of gives a more, you could say, academic version of Fela's thesis in Teacher Don't Teach Me Nonsense. If you haven't heard the song, I'd recommend you check it out. He says, democracy is not just about who governs and how they're chosen. More important, it's about how they govern, the institutions through which they govern, and the institutional identities by and through which they organize different categories of citizens. Colonialism was not just about the identity of governors, that they were white or European. It was even more so about the institutions they created to enable a minority to rule over a majority. Now, Fela in his song talks about culture and tradition being teachers, and Mamdani as well in a lot of his works, as well as many other works of other historians of colonial Africa have pointed out that much of what is considered culture and tradition and has been considered culture and tradition in the post-colonial period was distorted, modified, and even just outright invented, kind of like the Darbars and wonderful Darbars in northern Nigeria in the colonial period to serve particular interests. Most notably, it was conceived, this culture and tradition was conceived of as static and uniform and ahistorical, when the reality is that these cultures and traditions are and always have been living and dynamic. An interesting consequence of this is that the undemocratic imposition of quote unquote European democracy in late colonial and post-colonial African polities in many ways actually undermined indigenous democratic institutions and norms, as Professor Ochonu has argued, and numerous historians of the colonial period have pointed out. As the Yoruba proverb says, before the Oyinbo people brought bread, we didn't eat stones. African culture and tradition don't need to be engaged with uncritically. That's not the way they've worked pre-colonially, even in the colonial period. These traditions have always been critical, dynamic, and living and responsive. And those traditions or aspects of traditions that were not living, that were not critical, that were not dynamic, typically have not survived. Now, this is to warn us about the tendency, as Professor Mamdani wrote, that of resistance movements being shaped uncritically, unconsciously by the powers against which they rebel. They need not ape the powers against which they're rebelling. Now, this is not to blame Europe and the West for all of Africa's problems at all, but rather to suggest that we stop looking to the Europe and Western models as sources for all of the answers to the problems of the continent and its people. Because if you look around recently, they're not doing so well. The past few years with Brexit, the rise of more bold-faced fascism in Europe and the US, the Panama Papers, the January 6th riots, the COVID-19 crises, and the grossly unequal distribution of vaccines, as we've heard of from Professor Taiwo's paper, the acceleration of the climate crisis, and the even more unequal distribution of its costs and harmful effects, again, as we heard from Professor Taiwo, with these effects overwhelmingly being borne by those who contribute the least to the crisis, particularly Africans. You can see this in the vast difference in the Western coverage and reception in the crises and refugees from Ukraine versus those from Syria and Afghanistan or sub-Saharan Africa, and the obscene and growing gaps of wealth and health, both between and within countries. They've made clear, I argue, three things to most people, and this I think speaks to the kind of unique moment of humility, or this kind of confidence being on the back foot, as Professor Ochonu mentioned. One is that the Western would-be teachers, in Fela's term, or in Lugard's term, of development and democracy, in the Nigerian phrase, have no mouth to talk anymore. They're throwing stones from glass houses. The emperors may have large militaries and economies, but they don't have any clothes. In other words, they're claimed to be the heroes of world history, the models to be emulated, was always weak, but it's now widely laughable and understood to be so, even from people, Western academics. And part of the reason for this is the second lesson, I believe, recent things have kind of taught people generally, which is, in Fanon's word, the so-called developed world can no longer play the Sleeping Beauty and pretend that its wealth and security is not directly causing and caused by poverty and insecurity in other parts of the world. Fanon's dictum that Europe is literally the creation of the third world, the wealth which smothers her is that which was looted from underdeveloped peoples, end quote, is probably more obvious to Western and Western educated elites than any time in history since the early phase of imperial and colonial primitive accumulation, when there was no real need to hide behind euphemisms and political correctness. Most people, or many people, now know that their clothes are made in sweatshops in Bangladesh, and their iPhones are made in prison-like camps in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, with materials extracted from brutal mining operations on the African continent. The international order is clearly not democratic, nor was it intended to be. You can look at the structure of the UN, for example, even as supposedly international credit agencies use democracy indices to determine states' access to credit. So with the acute and existential threat of the climate crisis, the development model of outsourcing pollution and exploitative labor practices offshore or to carceral populations is clearly not globally generalizable. We're running out of places to pollute and people to kind of imprison and force into slave-like labor conditions. That's not generalizable to the global population. The US's rates of consumption, there's not enough stuff in the world for everyone to consume like we do in the US. And this brings me to the third concomitant lesson, is that the acuteness of this crisis means that we can't waste time blaming others or waiting for others to come save us. We need to do the work of reimagining and rebuilding different societies, economies, governments, etc. As really all of the panelists have spoken about. As Professor Mamdani noted, this will not just be done, and Professor Olupona echoed, and Professor Alidu also said, this won't just be done by professors in offices or even in conferences like this one, but rather by also working and organizing in communities, building communities, implementing and experimenting with different policies and practices. In these efforts, it's absolutely vital that we do not ignore the rich resources of African traditions, which are often now labeled as religious. And these traditions have served African peoples for millennia. Such traditions don't need to be romanticized, but as their resilience and as their continued resilience and as alternatives to current destructive hegemonic norms demonstrate, they can't be ignored. Without the quote unquote external critique that African indigenous, Islamic, and Christian traditions provide, we severely limit our political, social, moral, epistemic, and metaphysical imaginations and possibilities. And we can't afford to do that right now. The insightful and rich papers we've heard from today encourage us to take up this urgent challenge to rethink the nature and relationship between democracy and religion, not only about and for the African continent, but from its histories, in order to no longer, in Cabral's word, follow the progress of that is unequal European history, to the current and literal dead ends of history and human life. Remember Césaire's phrase in his essay on colonialism, at the end of the blind alley that is Europe, there's always Hitler. So we can't continue down this same road. We've seen where it leads. Instead, we need to try to create possibilities of new, or rather different histories, different formations of politics, society, and subjectivity, new horizons of possibility, of reality beyond the current limits, which are threatening not only our moral flourishing, but our very survival. So I'd like to conclude, as I did in the introduction yesterday, with the words of scholar and poet Fred Moten. Democracy is the name that has been assigned to a dream, as well as to certain already existing realities that are lived by many people as a nightmare. One must come to grips with the severity of the difference between what exists and what is yet to come under the name of democracy. By centering African perspectives and experiences, it is this difference and the possibilities of what is yet to come that our speakers today and yesterday have helped us to come to grips with and will continue to help us with as we continue these important conversations and the work for which they call. Thank you all so very much, and I look forward to continuing these conversations and this work with you in the future. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us.